universe is no stranger to horror, as the show tackles it in various different ways throughout the series. Episodes like Rose's Room tackle it in a more traditional sense, creating unsettling images that are ultimately nothing but temporarily creepy, with episodes like Nightmare Hospital ending up feeling more like homages to the genre, as the shots and music feel more horror-esque than anything else in the episode, which fades into the background of Connie and her mother's relationship. But this Halloween season, despite there being multiple episodes of the show that are actual Halloween specials, I'm going to instead focus on the episode I believe to have the best moment of genuine horror, coming in the middle of the show's second season with Keeping It Together, and that's what we're talking about today. In this video, we're going to go through this absolute roller coaster of an episode and discuss how everything builds up to one of the most tense scenes I've ever seen animated, and how it uses Garnet better than almost anywhere else in the series.
We need to track down Peridot. We found her pod. We know she's out there somewhere.
As I'll mention multiple times throughout this video, Keeping It Together is an episode full of misdirection, as despite being full of charming interactions between the gems, as well as some really fun animation while they all fold laundry together, the opening conversation, while it does reveal some about what the episode is going to entail, seems to be intentionally mixed in with a bunch of other hints that just throw you off. The episode opens to Garnet talking about what Peridot could be up to since her last appearance, against a still of the outside of the gem's house, with the implication being that she's conducting some kind of serious gem meeting, something immediately broken by the reveal of their laundry circle. And while this scene does have a variety of fantastic jokes and little moments within, as I especially love Pearl messing with the chore wheel, the real point of this opener is for the show to introduce 3 probable outlets for this episode to take, none of which end up actually happening. First, while they're folding laundry, Steven requests Garnet to unfuse into Sapphire and Ruby, setting up their appearance in the episode, which never actually comes, at least technically. Second, every time either Garnet or Pearl mention the horrors of the kindergarten, Amethyst looks visually uncomfortable, setting up her guilt over her creation to be a focal point of the episode, something that never actually comes. And while the third thing, which is the idea of this being a Peridot-centric story, obviously comes true to an extent, this episode really only uses her as a gateway to the moment they actually want to focus on. Anyway, we do get one final tiny misdirection before the gang leave the house for the kindergarten, in the form of this really sweet moment where Garnet calls for the crystal gems, only to have to remind Steven that that includes him after the events of Jailbreak. While the rest of this episode, besides a quick gag in the kindergarten, isn't really about Steven feeling like he's part of the group, I think establishing this idea early on does add to the fantastic moment alluded in this video's title, so I think it's less of a misdirection than the other 3. Anyway, enough misdirection talk for a bit, as our crystal gems make it to the kindergarten, with it not being very long after they split up that Steven runs into their target. Steven trying to lie to Peridot about whether or not the rest of his team is with him creates one of my favorite visual jokes in the show, as he eventually just gives up. And what follows is a really fun chase scene. It's short, but I feel like it does a good job in presenting Peridot as a combination of being an actual threat while also being pretty darn goofy, a contrast done better here than perhaps anywhere else in the show. Anyway, eventually Pearl and Amethyst sprint off to continue the chase as the camera stays on Steven and Garnet, where the bulk of the episode begins to seep in as Garnet notices that the injectors haven't been turned on, which is what they thought Peridot's plan was, as she and Steven set off to figure out what she's actually up to. And while the first half of this episode is filled with fun little moments as we catch back up to Peridot for the first time in the season, it's the second half that truly elevates Keeping It Together to being one of the best outings that the series has to to offer, as well as the reason I'm covering this episode in October. As Steven continues to ask questions about fusion, all of which Garnet answers with some kind of metaphorical junk that clearly doesn't actually explain what Steven wants to know, the show's colors get darker and darker as we progress further underground, with the music that kicks in ultimately setting the tone for the rest of the sequence. And while it's not exactly lo-fi hip-hop beats to relax/study to like much of the rest of the soundtrack, Shards, which I'm hopefully playing right now if copyright allows, is genuinely one of my favorite instrumentals ever composed for the show, as it completely captures the horrific nature of what our pair are about to uncover, as the corrupted mashup of discordant melodies all clash together to create this feeling of being trapped that fits quite well with what we're about to see. Speaking of which, to talk about how expertly this scene uses horror, let's start from the very beginning, as Steven and Garnet realize that Peridot has transformed this room into something that feels just so unnatural. Eventually, as the pair focuses on the shaking pillar, with the camera and music coming perfectly together to create the idea of this huge monster bursting from within, a strange foot fused with a hand suddenly falls behind the pair. One of my favorite parts of this scene comes with how they handle the tension throughout, as it doesn't release when the first experiment drops, or when the litany of limb creatures appear, or even when the creature is poofed to reveal what it's actually made of. The tension of this scene releases when Garnet realizes, likely at the same time as the audience, the implication of what they've discovered. Gems that have been shattered and forced together to create horrific attempts at a functioning creature. While both Garnet and the audience are still processing exactly what they're witnessing, the show continues its horror through the pillar from before finally bursting, and creating what is perhaps the most unsettling image in the entire series. While this moment is fairly short, the silhouettes of gems that Garnet probably recognizes trying to separate themselves from the experiment they've been posthumously forced into, helplessly screaming in agony as they glitch into a creature that feels like a mockery of the gem form, makes for an image that Steven, Garnet, and the audience is unlikely to ever forget. As Steven looks to Garnet, the most stable of his gem guardians, for any direction or anything, she remains frozen in horror, with the creature doing us the favor of knocking off her visor, as it tightens its grips on her physically and emotionally. And I think it's really interesting, given a conversation later in the episode, that Ruby's eye is the one that's tearing up in this moment, showing a rare instance of Ruby and Sapphire separately within Garnet before she even begins to split up. Garnet beginning to break off into her parts is done in a much more gruesome way than usual for Steven Universe, as she splits open from her center, with her heart seemingly breaking open. Eventually, as a result of Steven appealing to what he sees Garnet as, a fountain of stability, she manages to come together long enough to defeat the creature. Quite easily, in fact, revealing that the pair were never in serious physical danger, as the real horror always came from knowing what these creatures truly were. Even with the real danger out of this episode, we are still treated to a few more intense scenes, starting with what may be Estelle's best voice acting performance of the series, as she acts out both sides of an argument between Ruby and Sapphire, with the former seeming to imply that these experiments occurring on their fallen friends is their fault, with Sapphire trying to counter this idea until Pearl and Amethyst show up and the pair come together to lead the group once again. This argument is actually multi-layered based on whether or not that you've seen the rest of the series, as the first interpretation is that Ruby believes that the rebellion upset Homeworld to the point of doing this. However, once you've seen the answer and have the knowledge of how the pair came together to form Garnet for the first time, this line from Ruby about how this is what Homeworld thinks of fusion makes more sense. She's not saying that the crystal gems are why this is happening, she's specifically saying that if they didn't show Homeworld the fusion of two different gems, they never would have tried to do the same thing to gems that had already been shattered. This guilt that only they share completely retextualizes this entire scene, especially why they almost fell apart until Steven reminded them of the stable leader he sees them as. There is one final scene after Garnet snaps at her teammate, as we see her and Steven talk once she's calmed down, where she apologizes for the horrors that he saw and finally answers some questions about fusion. During this monologue, Garnet talks about how individuality is lost in long-term fusion, something that feels sweet in the context of Garnet, but devastating in the context of the experiments they just saw. The episode doesn't end on that bummer though, as we get one final sweet moment between Garnet and Steven in this fairly dire episode.
Don't want to break up a pair.
They belong together.
Given the vast amount of different things that fusion has represented throughout Steven Universe, there's almost an infinite amount of thematic ways to interpret the corruption of this idea that we see in the form of the experiments. And while you can come to your own conclusion about what exactly the crew was going for here, I want to spend the final portion of this video talking about Garnet throughout this episode, and how the different parts of her react to what they see. As soon as Garnet first realizes that these experiments are gem shards forced together, the only thing she can do is freeze, something likely a result of her different halves wanting to do different things. Ruby becomes immediately overrun with emotion and anger, as seen through her eye being the one to initially tear up, likely wanting to explode and go berserk on the experiments. On the other hand, Sapphire also becomes emotional, but tries to take a more thoughtful approach to what the pair is witnessing. Something impossible because of Ruby's emotions, which ultimately caused the fusion to do nothing but stand still. Eventually, because of Steven's plea reminding them of the stability that their relationship represents, Ruby and Sapphire come together to at least defeat the monster created from the remains of their friends before discussing what's on both of their minds, as Ruby sees this as nothing but the consequences of their actions, as they introduced the cross-gen fusion that developed into the horrors in front of them. One of my favorite parts of this episode is how they deal with Garnet overcoming this trauma, as she's not fully better by the end of this scene, still snapping at Pearl and Amethyst. And when we do see her once she's somewhat moved past it, at least enough to put on a happy face for Steven, it's been an unknown amount of time. While talking it out helped, the only thing that could truly ever lead Ruby and Sapphire to move forward as Garnet after what they saw wasn't some magical solution, but time. And I really like how this episode handled that. Garnet, as a character throughout the show, sometimes goes back and forth in whether or not she's thematically her own person or just the representation of the love between Sapphire and Ruby. And I think this episode handles that dichotomy really well, with Steven and Garnet's conversation at the end, where the show takes the stance that it's not just one or the other, but that it's always both. Keeping It Together is an episode that will likely always be remembered for its impeccable use of horror to demonstrate the true nature of gem experiments that is never quite replicated in their future appearances. But at the core of this episode is a character study of Garnet and what she represents that truly feels somehow just as impressive. Anyway, that's about it for me. If you want to see me avoid tweeting for days whenever a video does poorly, you can find my Twitter somewhere in the description. But either way, this has been AmpleSamuel, and I'll hopefully see you on Halloween with my final video for the spooky season. And then the Steven Universe movie sometime in November, I promise, hopefully. Thanks for watching.